Welcome back, everybody. This is Retro Replay with a retro review of the North American launch games for the Sony Playstation. The PlayStation was released in North America on September 9th, 1995, with 10 games available. This was a very exciting time for me and gamers in general. But for myself, this was 4 days after my 15th birthday. I remember going to Northgate Mall in Cincinnati, Ohio, and waiting in line outside of a Babbage's electronics store before they opened to get my hands on this new piece of hardware. I had previously purchased a Sega Saturn earlier that year, but had to return it because it did not come with the proper video cables to connect it to RF in the back of my TV. And I couldn't play it, and I couldn't afford the cables to hook it up to the VCR, so I actually returned it. And I'm actually very glad that I did. It was a wise decision at the time because the Sony PlayStation ended up dominating that generation, and this was the beginning of Sega's downfall. After I returned my Sega Saturn, I distinctly remember reading an Electronics Gaming Monthly magazine that had a spread on the upcoming Sony PlayStation. And I just remember seeing screenshots of Mortal Kombat 3 and how absolutely amazing it looked and how arcade perfect it looked, even though it actually wasn't. Even though Mortal Kombat was not a launch game, it was still what excited me to make this purchase, and I knew this was going to be my way forward in gaming. Unfortunately, the PlayStation did not have a strong games lineup at launch. There are a couple gems here, but in general, the lineup was very weak and disappointing. And this is somewhat surprising because the console had been out in Japan for a long time already, and they had a lot of time to prepare for this launch, but the games were just not strong. And to start off with here, we have one of the weakest games of the launch. This is Kileak, the DNA Imperative. I actually bought this game at launch. I thought it looked amazing in screenshots. You know, this was when first-person shooters were just starting to make it onto consoles, and how amazing that could be to be able to play games like this. But once I got it in my hands, I realized how bland and boring this actually was. The best part of this game is probably the CGI cutscenes, but in general, it's just a generic corridor shooter. The level design is absolutely horrible, and I really don't have much good to say about this at all. Next up, we have Power Serve 3D Tennis. Probably the worst release out of all the launch games for the PlayStation. I mean, just look at this footage. The camera itself makes you want to throw up. It's absolutely nauseating to watch. The graphics are just terrible. I mean, listen to the music. The music is just horrible. 15. I just can't figure out what they were thinking with the camera in this game. It's like it follows the ball and is tied to the ball, so every time the ball bounces, the camera bounces. It's just horrible to play and to watch. And I will not make you suffer through this too much longer here. Next up, we have the Raiden Project, which is a compilation of the arcade games Raiden 1 and Raiden 2. I personally am a huge fan of the shoot 'em up genre in general. I really enjoyed these games at the PlayStation launch. They aren't the most graphically amazing games, but these are great arcade ports. They're very well done, they're very fun, and they're very challenging. With the 16-bit generation, and especially the Sega Genesis, it was always thought that we were getting as close as we could to the arcade versions of these games at home. But it really wasn't until the Sony Playstation that we started seeing arcade-perfect games. I don't know that this game is 100% arcade-perfect and accurate, but it is really damn close. I really enjoyed this game at launch, and I still enjoy going back to it today. I'm not very good at it anymore. These games can be very challenging, and it takes a lot of practice to get back into them and to make it far in these games. But they are still fun to go back to, and these are two-player games, so you can sit couch co-op and play these with a friend, which can be very fun. And also included in this package, as stated before, is Raiden 2, which is very similar to Raiden 1. It's just a little bit more advanced graphically and a little bit more challenging, I would say. It's a little bit closer to the bullet hell genre, although not quite there yet. You can see in this footage that you start with somewhat of a weak weapon, and as you destroy these enemies, they may drop these gems, and the gems change color as they are populating the screen, and the color of the gem when you pick it up determines what kind of weapon you get. As you can see there, it turned blue, and that means I picked up a laser weapon. And if you continue to pick up blue gems, that laser weapon will get stronger and stronger. Same if you pick up red, it just basically makes the weapon you have get stronger and stronger. If you change colors, it switches you to that weapon. I'm doing terrible though in this footage. Like I said, this game is quite a bit more challenging than Raiden 1. There's a lot more enemies on screen, and it is quite a bit more difficult. Next up, we have everyone's favorite Street Fighter game, Street Fighter the movie. Now, of course, that was a little tongue-in-cheek, but this game got a very bad rap when it launched. I think primarily that is due to the graphic style. It was a major departure from the other renowned Street Fighter games. And instead of using the animated sprites like they did in the original Street Fighter games, they went with these photorealistic, pre-rendered sprites of the actual actors in the movies. This is very similar to how Mortal Kombat produced their graphics, but it was just a major departure for Street Fighter, and I think it caught a lot of people off guard and rubbed them the wrong way. Because of this, it just got a bad rap at launch. I think that's a little unfair. The game is actually decent. It's not terrible. It plays a lot like the Street Fighter games. It just doesn't look like them. And similar to the other Street Fighter games, this version of this game suffers from a lot of slowdown at certain points in the fighting. You can see the animations just slowing down, the gameplay slowing down. It's a little off-putting in general, but the other Street Fighter games suffered from the same thing, especially on console, so it's not that much different. In general, I kind of liked going back and playing this a bit. It was fun to go back to and see again. It is a very interesting version of Street Fighter. It's not the best, but it definitely is not as bad as what people have made it out to be over the years. And it has Jean-Claude Van Damme in it, and anything with Jean-Claude Van Damme is pure gold. Next up is Battle Arena Toshinden. I think this game got a lot of people hyped up for the launch of the PlayStation. It's definitely in the same vein as Virtua Fighter and Tekken. It definitely uses that style of graphics. It's a 3D fighter. You have 3D movement, so you can move in and out as well as left and right. The game ended up being very disappointing. It's very slow. You can see from this footage how slow the gameplay is. It's just not very exciting. It's hard to control. I did not enjoy this game much at all. I did buy this game at launch, and it was probably one of my most disappointing purchases that I made at that time. I believe there's also something wrong with the ROM that I'm using for this footage. I believe there should be music playing in the background. It just sounds really dull. Next up is Total Eclipse Turbo. This was originally a 3DO game, a Panasonic 3DO game, and is arguably the best game on the Panasonic 3DO. And if you've ever seen footage of this game running on a 3DO, it runs very slow with a very slow frame rate. But that is on purpose, and it allows the game to control properly. There's some negative information surrounding this version of this game on PlayStation. They called this Total Eclipse Turbo because the game is basically faster than the 3DO version. It runs faster, but the problem is that the controls are tied to the frame rate. So as the game moves faster, so do the button presses, and it makes the vehicle very difficult to control. I've seen some footage of this game and some other reviews from some other YouTubers basically saying that the game is unplayable. I wouldn't say it's unplayable. I actually made it into the 3rd level before I stopped playing. I only blew my ship up a couple times. It does get a little hectic as you're trying to go through these corridors because the controls are so twitchy and it's very easy to run into the walls, and the control just isn't very good. But I would definitely not say it's unplayable. But in general, the game was not designed to move this fast. So as you go through some of these corridors, the ship is just moving way too fast for its own good, and it can make you lose control of your ship as you're going through some of the tight turns and things like that. But in general, it's not bad. It's an okay game. I had fun coming back and playing this and experiencing it for myself. I did not own this at launch, so this is actually my first time playing it after seeing some of the negative information available online. I do own a Panasonic 3DO, and I do own a physical copy of this game on 3DO. So I do plan on going and doing another review of the 3DO version of this game so that we can do a comparison and show the differences and just show how much faster this game moves compared to the 3DO version and the challenges that creates. I just find it amusing that they added the word turbo into the title of this game and just put it on better hardware and made it run faster. I think that's very funny. Next up, we have the classic Ridge Racer. I definitely owned this game at launch, and I absolutely loved it. I thought the graphics were mind-blowing at the time. This was an arcade game. This is not nearly as good as the arcade game graphically, but it was still very impressive at the time.
3, 2, 1, go!
Even today, I think it still looks really neat. It's definitely aged a lot, but it still looks very cool, in my opinion. The problem is there's just not a lot of content here. The racing is decent, but it just gets very stale over time. There's only one track, and the track itself has extensions on it. So if you go into higher difficulties, there may be a turn on the course that you couldn't get to on the easier difficulties, and it takes you down a different part of the track. But it's all part of the same track. So there's not a lot of variety here. There's not a lot of replay value. It's just a decent racing game, and the technical prowess of this at the launch of the PlayStation was quite impressive. It was a nice introduction to the Ridge Racer series in general for home console users. I played Ridge Racer Revolution, Rage Racer, R4, Ridge Racer Type 4, which was a fantastic game. This was just kind of the introduction to that, and it was a decent attempt. You could see there where I turned left. This is the extension of the track into the hard difficulty. You can see how narrow it is, and there's some tight turns through here, although it's still not that difficult. But that's just how these tracks work, or the track works. It just has some varying turns on it that make the same course change. I always remember how mind-blowing it was for my 15-year-old self to see these helicopters flying over and things like that. It was just something we had never seen in games before. These 3D graphics were so new to everyone. Even though they look janky today, they were quite impressive at the time. I also just want to briefly mention the music in this game. It's insane. Next, we have Rayman. This is actually the first game in the Rayman series and was very impressive at the time. The graphics in this game are just beautiful. It has amazing animation, incredible art design, and artwork. It's just a very pretty game. The gameplay itself is okay. It's a platformer game, as you can see here, and as you play the game, you unlock more abilities. So you'll see through this footage that I unlock the punching ability. So at first here, you can't do anything except jump. Right here, I unlock the punch ability to be able to start punching enemies, and then later in this footage, you'll see that I unlock an ability to grab onto ledges, which allows you to get up to higher areas. So there is a little bit of a Metroid feel to this. I don't want to say that too much, but as you unlock these abilities, it allows you to go back to these levels and reach areas that you could not get to previously. As the first entry in the Rayman series, this game was quite impressive and a very good game, and probably one of the top 2 or 3 launch games for the Sony PlayStation. This did launch Rayman into the forefront, and there's been many Rayman games since this time. And I'd just like to say the more modern Rayman games that were released within the last 5 to 10 years or so have been incredible. The artwork is just amazing. They are some of the most beautiful games that you can play, and they're also very fun. I played through one of the more recent Rayman games co-op with one of my friends, and we just absolutely loved it. I adore this franchise, and I'm looking forward to more games in the future. This is just a brief snippet of the first boss fight in the game, And Rayman, being the great dude that he is, defeats these bosses and then becomes friends with them. How sweet is that? One thing that's kind of neat about the Rayman series is it does introduce a lot of different variety into the gameplay. As you can see here, this is a little bit of a shoot 'em up side scroller feel. After you befriend this mosquito, you get to ride on him and punch your enemies as you're going through this little flying section. I do have some footage here of another level where you're going up. You're jumping as the water is flooding the stage. You have to move fast enough to get past the water and go vertical through the levels. This is just the first world of this game, so it doesn't look very similar as far as the art design and the levels, but it is a pretty big game. There's a lot of variety later on in the game, but I didn't really capture that in this footage. In here, I just unlocked the power or ability to hang, which becomes very important in this next section of the game. This is what I was just referring to before as far as moving vertically through the levels. So you can see I have to go through here. I can grab onto ledges now, and I basically have to move fast enough to not drown in this water as it's moving up the screen. It's just giving a lot of variety in the gameplay. But all in all, this is a very good game. Like I said, maybe the best launch game for the PlayStation. I really enjoyed coming back and playing this. I want to go back and play it more. I'd like to actually finish this game. It is very fun to play. Next up, we are going to introduce some 90s attitude into some games here. This is ESPN Extreme Games, and is obviously taking advantage of the extreme sports genre that became very popular in the 90s. I mean, just look at this intro. This intro might be the best part of this game. It's not a very fun game. It's, at its root, just a racing game. It's similar to Road Rash. You race, but you can also beat your opponents. You can punch and kick them as you're racing. There's different quote-unquote vehicles or methods of racing. So you can be on rollerblades, bike, street luge. So there's some differences there, and as you're racing, you're trying to go through these gates. There's some jumps to go off of, and you're trying to kick and punch your opponents and knock them off the track. The game is not easy. It can be very difficult. It can be a little frustrating because the opponents are vicious. It can be a little difficult to control. There's a lot of obstacles that you can run into that can wreck you, as shown here. It looks kind of cool. The graphics are decent. It's just not that fun to play. There is some variety here in the levels. I think there's 5 or 6 different levels that you can race in. And like I said, 4 different methods of transportation or of vehicles that you can race on. But this game is definitely a great example of the extreme sports attitude in the 90s. It's quite funny to go back to this and play it again and just see what ESPN was trying to put out for sports genres. I mean, obviously this isn't a real sport, but they tried to make it feel as extreme as possible. As I played this a little more, I started to get the hang of the controls. This is one of my best little runs here of kicking the opponents and finishing this race. I only finished in 13th, but that was actually one of my best finishes. And last on the list is NBA Jam Tournament Edition. This is one of my favorite video game series. I have fond memories of playing this game in the arcade, and I played it a lot on the 16-bit consoles. And those games, while they were very fun, they were very compromised graphically. They had very small sprites, but like I said, they were still fun to play. They captured the fun and the excitement of the gameplay. They just didn't look very good. Now this game on the PlayStation, I don't know that it is arcade perfect, but it looks pretty close. The graphics are great, the sprites are huge, the animations are good. One thing I do notice about this game is that it does not play like the arcade games. The AI opponents do not play the same, so it has definitely been tweaked some for this console version. I have the NBA Jam arcade 1-up machine, which has the arcade games, and it plays quite different than this. The AI opponents in this are absolutely vicious and will knock you down at every moment. This was a very difficult game, but I still enjoyed it a lot. It's still very fun to play, and especially fun to play 2-player or even 4-player with the multi-tap adapter. But that pretty much wraps up this video. This was great to come back and revisit these launch games. This was a great time of my youth, and it's fun to go back and revisit this. But again, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe and click that bell icon for notifications. Thank you.